And at this moment, if she's ready, I'd like to present to you the chair of the History Department, Dr. Amy Woodson Bolton.
I am very impressed with this turnout. I have to say, I didn't know what to expect, but you are hardy souls to come out in actual weather, which is fabulous. So it is such a pleasure to introduce Father Buckley, who preceded me as chair of the History Department. He was here in our department chair from 1990 to 1994, so I am following in his esteemed footsteps. I wanted to say a few words. We want to leave the talk to him, but the idea of religious freedom and as it developed in the late 18th century in the colonies, as we call it, those of us who do British history, like myself, the idea of fighting against an established church, I think one of the things that Father Buckley does so well in this project is that it wasn't done just because you say that you have separated the church and the state, whatever those entities mean. Even when you have done so in a statute, in a state, and then as it develops in the context of the First Amendment to the Constitution, it's not finished because it then had to be explored in terms of what does that actually mean? What does that mean for church property? What does that mean for the actual powers of churches, for the actual powers of the state? And from the point of view of the British context, in the context of the Church of England, these were issues that the British had been dealing with, of course, really since Henry VIII had established the Church of England itself as a state religion with the king at the head of the church. So this is a very long story, in fact, and Britain took a very different path to the question of establishing religious freedom in that in the new United States, the concept of freedom emerged first, the articulation of the idea of freedom and separation of church and state, and then they had to work out what that meant. In Britain, the battle was much more articulated over the question of what the Church of England would be and who would be admitted into it, low church, high church, broad church, and then fighting over that entity itself. The disestablishment of the Church of England itself would take much longer, but many of the issues remained the same in the 19th century, and I think that convergence over, for example, secular schools. What do you do with the public school system? Do you have religious schools? And I think what's so interesting, and again, what Father Buckley shows, is that in both Britain and America, that have the idea of religious freedom and the idea of a government that is not necessarily connected to any single religious entity, although, again, that's more complicated perhaps in Britain than here in terms of our articulations of it. That is an unending process. That's a process of continual reinvention and realignment, and it's a process of every generation having actually to figure out what that means. So I think Father Buckley, one of the things that he does here that we're about to hear that's so exciting from a historian's point of view is that he shows in detail in those generations around before and after Thomas Jefferson what that meant in these particular contexts and how these questions of an idea, a concept like religious freedom, then actually has to get enacted in very particular local contexts, which is exactly what historians find so thrilling and so exciting, how we can talk about big concepts, but ultimately it comes down to people. So without further ado, thank you so much, and here's Father Buckley.
Thank you very much, Professor Woodson Bolton. Thank you very much. She's a very kind chair. She takes in us antiques and takes wonderful care of us. You know, do I need this microphone?
No, I can take that away.
Can you hear me back there? Yeah. Let me get rid of this thing because I'll just knock it off the podium. Thank you very much. This disappeared?
There it goes.
I want to talk about this book a bit today. It took a long time to write. And actually, I started working on this book in 1972. And that was my doctoral dissertation, and then that was published later on in the 70s. And then I started on this other project of, okay, you passed the statute for religious freedom, what does it mean? And I worked on that, and I put out different articles over the years. And then I got fascinated by divorce. And so then I did a book on divorce. That was juicy. That was really fun to do. And absolutely fascinating. And then I wanted to know, what did this do to people's insides? Because I could read the petition, so I knew what they said about their life, but I didn't know how they really felt about it inside. And then I stumbled across this incredible collection of letters between a man and a divorced woman. And I published those letters. I transcribed those letters because I had to see what they said. And that became the last chapter of the book on divorce. But then the letters were just absolutely fascinating for mid-19th century revelations about gender relations, for example. And then I really got into battered women and the story of how that happens and the background for that. Well, so, it's kind of like, way leads on to way. And then I returned to finish off this book, which is really a broader study of the whole shebang, of everything, from Jamestown to the Supreme Court in the 1940s when they nationalized the First Amendment. But it's great stuff, and I've had a great run of it. And it all began for me right here at LMU in 1974 when I came on the campus for the first time. In 1878, the Supreme Court had a major case to decide. It really dealt with what Congress had done. Congress had outlawed polygamy. Imagine that. Would they do that today? They had outlawed polygamy, and the federal courts were enforcing that law in Utah Territory. See? It only pertained to an area where the federal government had power, a territory, not a state. So the federal courts enforced that law in Utah Territory, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was asserting the right to practice polygamy on the grounds of the Free Exercise of Religion Clause. Now, that created great consternation in the country. The cartoonists had a field day with that issue. But golly, it was interesting. And, I wonder, today, if that was an issue, which way would the courts go? How would they have gone with same-sex marriage in the 1870s? I think we could all say we pretty much know where they would have gone. But it brings out the question of the relationship between law and culture, which is such a fascinating issue today. At any rate, the Supreme Court had never ruled before this case, had never ruled before on the First Amendment. And the Chief Justice, Morrison Waite, was determined to get it right. So, who did he go to? He went to an historian. He went to his Washington neighbor and good friend, George Bancroft, who was the outstanding American historian of the era in the 1870s and 80s. And Bancroft suggested that what Waite needed to do was to look at the work of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison during the passage of the Virginia Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom in the century before that. And the Chief Justice followed that advice, and his decision in Reynolds versus the United States fixed the course the Supreme Court has followed ever since. Now, this relationship between church and state is among the most enduring concerns of Western civilization. It embraces the two subjects my mother said I should never talk about in public, religion and politics, because all it does is start fights. Her advice was good advice, always was a good advice, but of course I didn't follow it. And the topic was just too fascinating to pass up. The questions of religion and politics, of church and state, they embody our deepest human concerns, you know? Our deepest human concerns. How should we live together? How should we live together as a people? And what place, if any, will God have in our society? You can't duck those issues. And over the centuries, various different resolutions have been attempted. In America, the most important resolution occurred in Virginia. Most important because the documents and the history of the Virginia church-state settlement became, thanks to George Bancroft, the basis for the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. Now, recall how that First Amendment begins. Congress shall make no law. It says nothing about the states. Nothing about the states. Congress shall make no law. So it did not apply to the states until the Cantwell and Everson decisions in the 1940s. And then the court returned to the Virginia story of the church-state settlement, and they nationalized the First Amendment. So they extended the First Amendment to all the states. That was a very different way of dealing with church and state. So it's a Virginia story, but it has national, and now with the international courts, it has international import. The centerfold is Thomas Jefferson's Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom. Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom. The history of that statute, from its colonial background, its passage through the state legislature, and then its subsequent interpretation, its lived history, as it is, its lived history in Virginia for a century and a half. That's the subject of this book. Shortly after the foundation, so let's go back to the beginning. And shortly after the foundation of Jamestown in 1607, Virginia's colonial government established the Church of England in law. It fixed it in law. And as Dr. Woodson Bolton pointed out, it would be just expected because it had been established in England. So they're simply carrying on what it had been before. Now, what did an establishment mean? In the words of one astute colonial clergyman, it meant that the colonial church was incorporated and blended with the state. Incorporated and blended with the state. Public taxation supported that church. Public funds paid the salaries of its clergymen. Other religious groups were barely tolerated. By the middle of the 18th century, this did not sit well with the ranks of the religious dissenters. But that church and state fit together like a hand and a glove. And that bothered the Presbyterians and the Baptists especially. And they were growing. The center ranks were growing as the Great Awakening spread across the colonial world. And they challenged, these Baptists and Presbyterians, they challenged the established church's hegemony. And they found a natural ally in Enlightenment thought as embodied the next generation of young Virginians. Most especially people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison objected to the idea of toleration. What do you mean toleration? We want freedom. We want complete religious freedom. And their language prevailed in the 16th article of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the first Bill of Rights in 1776, came out of Virginia. And it found that complete religious liberty found its fullest expression in a decade later in Thomas Jefferson's statute for establishing religious freedom. Now, by that time, most folks in Virginia accepted the principle that people were entitled to religious liberty. Not all its implications, but they accepted the principle. They thought about the implications. Let me give you 3 examples of what they disagreed about. Religion. What was religion? Was religion what George Mason wrote it was in the Bill of Rights of Virginia? Was it a duty you owe to your Creator? Or was it what Thomas Jefferson would write in his statute for religious freedom? Religion was opinion. Religion was an opinion. You have your opinions, I have mine. So, that was contested. That was contested. Or again, most Virginians believed that you had to have a virtuous citizenry to make a republic work. If we're going to have this funny thing where everybody's supposed to participate, we better have lots of virtue. We could say that today, too, couldn't we? But they disagreed. What they disagreed about was how that virtue should be produced. Patrick Henry looked to religion and the church to produce virtue. Thomas Jefferson preferred education and the schoolhouse as a locus for producing virtue. What was the state's role in this then, if it had any? A third contentious point. Individuals had rights. On this there was broad agreement. But did believers who formed a church have any corporate rights? What were the corporate rights of the members of a church? What was their legal status, if they had any? And what was that church's relationship to the political community? Or did it have any? Lots of questions, lots of issues, lots of concerns. Now, shortly after the American Revolution, what had been the established Church of England reorganized itself into the Protestant Episcopal Church of Virginia. That was its formal title, the Protestant Episcopal Church of Virginia. And the state legislature incorporated it as such in 1784. And it reconfirmed its title, excuse me, and they reconfirmed its title to all of the colonial churches and all the colonial property that Church of England, when it was established in Virginia, had possessed. That was a lot of property. And the cemeteries, too. Now, at the same time, the General Assembly considered a religious assessment. They had stopped the taxes for the church. So now, how are we going to raise money? How are we going to keep the preachers in the pulpit? How are we going to keep things going? So they took a leaf out of Massachusetts, and they proposed, which had done this, and they proposed a religious assessment, or a tax on everybody, for the support of the church of their choice. But the erstwhile dissenters, especially the Presbyterians and the Baptists, cried foul. They saw this as a package deal. The incorporation of the church and now this general assessment, this is a package deal to make the old, hated, established church revive. And there was a massive petition campaign. Massive. They loaded down the tables in the assembly with protests against this proposal, this general assessment. And it was led by the Baptists and the Presbyterians and assisted by Madison's famous memorial and remonstrance against a religious assessment. Now, the legislature saw this huge reaction. And they said, okay, all the deals are off. And they turned down any discussion of an assessment and instead immediately passed Thomas Jefferson's statute for religious freedom, which Jefferson had written 6-7 years before. So that still wasn't enough to satisfy the former dissenters, now evangelical churches. And the next year, they pushed the legislature to repeal the incorporation of the Episcopal Church. And a dozen years later, after a relentless campaign by the Baptists, they did something extraordinary. First of all, they voided all previous laws the legislature had passed from the beginning of the colonial period dealing with religion. All laws were pulled out. Just went through the whole shebang and knocked them all out. Repealed all the laws dealing with religion except Jefferson's statute for religious freedom. Still, that wasn't enough. And finally, in 1802, in the most remarkable socio-economic revolution in revolutionary America, the legislature reneged on all earlier guarantees and provided for the seizure and sale of the Episcopal Church's farmlands, its property. They grabbed all that property. That didn't happen anywhere else in the New World. I mean, the revolution in part was conducted for the sake of property, to save property and secure property. But now, following this article and then Jefferson's statute, they're saying, well, what this means now is that all this property should go to the good citizens of the state. So they took all the glebes and farmlands. They took all the glebes and farmlands and parish houses. They seized all that property, and they left the churches in Episcopalian hands. And they left the cemeteries. They got to keep the cemeteries too.
What's a glebe?
A glebe is a farmland. It's farmland. So, for example, if you go to Arlington, have Glebe Road. Glebe Road is where the churches were. And these glebes were often extensive, 500-600 acres, and valuable farmland property. And they said, in a stunning burst of naivete, that this seizure of the property was designed to reconcile all the good people of this commonwealth. Well, the chances of reconciliation were zero. For the next century and a half, as evangelical Protestantism became the dominant religious force, Virginians wrangled over numerous church-state issues. For example, everyone agreed that the individual was free to believe. But how free was the church? The church as the body of believers. How free were they to act corporately as a group? Could they hold property? Intent on separating church and state, the legislature forbade the legal incorporation of churches and religious groups. Just forbade it. And church-sponsored institutions, forget it. So, an example. When Joseph Gallego, the owner of Gallego Mills, the biggest flour concern in the United States at the time, when he died and left a bequest to the Catholic community of Richmond to build a church, a Virginia court voided that bequest on the grounds that while certainly he had written this thing, there was no legal entity to receive the funds. For a church to hold property without elaborate subterfuges took years to achieve. And even then, the amount of property a church could own was severely limited in law. While the legislature busily incorporated virtually every other operation possible, no religious groups could apply. From the church's perspective, This state policy obstructed their efforts and ability to raise funds, to construct buildings, to establish institutions, to maintain works of charity, to educate their clergy and adherents, and carry out missionary activities. Ironically, in light of the common perception that Jefferson's statute guaranteed full religious freedom and separation of church and state, the churches and religious groups were less free in Virginia than they were in any other state in the Union. What about the clergy? The voters of Matthew County elected Humphrey Billups to the lower house of the state assembly in 1826. Although no petitions from Matthews County or from anyone else challenged his election, some legislators wanted to disqualify him on the grounds that he was a Methodist preacher. Virginia's Constitution of 1776 forbade clergymen from holding elective office. But 10 years later, the legislature approved Jefferson's statute. So was Billups going to be able to go there or not? If you look at the statute, that's what it says. Look at the last line. This is the enabling clause of the Virginia statute. And that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Okay? What about Mr. Billups' civil capacities? What about his rights? In refusing to seat him in the legislature, the committee argued that while, I'm quoting now, while our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions, Jeffersonian language, yet, quote, our ancestors intended to separate church and state. Is that so? An historian happening on the scene might well observe that church-state separation had not been the Virginia Assembly's intent when it wrote the state constitution in 1776, but rather the interpretation that Jefferson gave to the First Amendment in 1802, and that later Virginians gave Jefferson's statute. Thanks to Humphrey Billups and the voters of Matthews County, the legislators in 1827 found themselves entangled in church-state controversy. Now, surely we can sympathize with them. Issues of religious liberty and the respective claims of church and state have repeatedly divided our courts and our nation. And we know the cases. They're familiar. That was Jefferson's Danbury Baptist letter, in which he talked about separation of church and state. But you know the issues. They range from Christmas crutches in city parks to school prayer, to church property. How much property should a church be allowed to own? How much should be tax exempt, if any? How about Sabbath observance? We all know those cases. How about chaplains in the legislature? How about prayer in the legislature? Maybe they need more prayer in the legislature. I think the chaplain in the House of Representatives has his work cut out for him. It's a good thing it's a Jesuit. But we've seen these cases, well over 100 cases, or maybe 150 cases like this, have been adjudicated since the 1947 Everson decision, in which the Supreme Court turned the Establishment Clause and made it to apply to the states. Speaking for the court in that case, the Everson case, Hugo Black, the justice who wrote the case for the majority, pointed out that the Virginia statute had offered the most ironclad guarantee of religious liberty in the new United States. The First Amendment, Black concluded, intended to provide, quote, the same protection against government intrusion on religious liberty as the Virginia Statute. Writing for the minority, Justice Wiley Rutledge embraced Black's interpretive approach. And get this quote: "No provision of the Constitution is more closely tied to or given content by its generating history than the religion clause of the First Amendment. Indeed, the Virginia Statute," he wrote, "belongs to the warp and woof." Isn't that a great expression? The warp and woof of our constitutional tradition. From the court's prerogative perspective in 1947, the First Amendment stipulated strict separation of church and state, a wall of separation, as the justices quoted Jefferson. A big wall of separation. At the beginning of the 19th century, even before the controversy over Billups, Virginians made similar claims to the statute for establishing religious freedom. In this respect, the Virginia church-state relationship differed notably from other states, yet it anticipated the direction that the nation as a whole would take. Simply asserting separation and invoking the First Amendment has not solved the church-state problematic in America, nor did appeals to the statute settle church-state controversies in Virginia. In his prize-winning study of Thomas Jefferson, American Sphinx, historian Joseph Ellis, wonderful historian, expressed the received popular and scholarly wisdom when he claimed that Jefferson's, quote, most enduring legacy was, quote, religious freedom, defined as the complete separation of church and state. But what did complete separation mean? Professor Ellis didn't say. So this book, Establishing Religious Freedom, explores the lived experience of the statute in Virginia's prolonged and exhausting arguments over church-state separation. The point is, the meaning of Jefferson's statute was never fixed. It was never fixed. And the heart of the problem was cultural. Culture. Culture and law. How fascinating that we can discover the way in which the law influences the culture and the culture influences the interpretation of the law. As evangelical Protestantism dominated the religious landscape, lay elites began to view the statute as a barrier to another key value. They wanted separation of church and state, but they wanted another value too. They wanted to spread the gospel. They wanted to spread the gospel. But they didn't want, therefore, the interpretation of the statute to prevent their evangelical vision of Virginia as a Christian commonwealth. So they want it both ways. They want it both ways. While consistently championing the language of church-state separation, they expected their civil authorities to support a legal code reflecting their Christian values, a kind of functional establishment of Protestant Christianity is what they had in mind. Let me offer two examples, and then I'll quit. Marriage and education. With regard to marriage, should the state sanction divorce? Go back to divorce. Just fascinating subject. And all those petitions are in the Virginia State Library. And you could call them over. I spent about 10 summers going through collecting divorce petitions. Hundreds of them. They're just positively juicy. But should the state sanction divorce? With regard to marriage, to allow divorce and remarriage placed the state in opposition to the express commandment of Christ in the New Testament. But what about the statute of religious freedom? Secondly, divorce violated the Anglican tradition embedded in Virginia's colonial history. It required the explosive issue of interracial sex before the legislature passed its first divorce bill in 1802. And it was not until the 1850s that the state constitution made provision for the courts to handle divorce in carefully limited cases. So you want a divorce? Rough rabbits. It's not going to happen. Very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. Even in the most incredible cases of battery and of spousal abuse and desertion and so forth. Scripture doesn't allow it. And we have to follow the Scriptures in a state that separates church and state. Or education, whether it's private or public, that was a huge battleground. The legislature became very nervous when the trustees of Methodist colleges like Randolph-Macon wanted a charter. The government's going to issue a charter. Is it going to issue a charter to a school that teaches theology? How can they do that? That's mixing state and church. Only with the express proviso that such a college could never have a professor of theology. Could never have a professor of theology. So they wrote those into the charters of these colleges as they created them across the landscape. In elementary and secondary education, you have Jefferson's University there, but you have another Virginia school. Jefferson got his university, of course, but it would be a long time. Virginia did not have a public school system until well after the Civil War. And the fight in the 1870s pitted two Presbyterian ministers against each other. It was delicious. The legislature selected William Henry Ruffner as the first state superintendent of public instruction. And Ruffner resigned from the ministry to have that position. Robert Louis Dabney, the professor of theology at Hampton-Sydney College, argued vehemently against public education on both racial and religious grounds. If Virginia established public education, he warned that it would have to educate the newly emancipated slaves, and nobody wanted to spend money on them. In his view, that would be simply too expensive. But most important, Dabney argued that the state could not have any religious teaching, in its public schools because of Jefferson's statute. But education without religion would be tantamount to blasphemy, he said. Therefore, we can't have any public schools in Virginia. And Ruffner fought back. Ruffner fought back on both counts, urging the education of African Americans as citizens. They're citizens, so they should be educated. But his position on religion in the schools was more nuanced. He accepted Jefferson's statute and the problems of that. But he said, there was no need to put religious training or the Bible into the formal curriculum. Christianity, he argued, would come in on its own. It would come in on its own. The teachers, the parents, and the students would all want it. There was no need to lay down any laws or any formal procedure. It will come in its own. The culture would bring it in. And that would be, in his words, the Virginia system. We don't pass a law, we just kind of do it. A few decades later, the school authorities in Richmond, Virginia, the capital, debated resolutions to require Bible reading. It was now being used informally in the city schools, but some wanted it specified. Most of the city's public most of the city's Protestant clergymen favored it. They wanted the legislation of school prayer. The two chief opponents of this were a Jewish rabbi and a Baptist pastor, Rabbi Kalish and Pastor McDaniel. There was no need, they said, to tinker with Ruffner's Virginia system. It works. And the school board agreed with them. And that policy, the Virginian system, existed in Virginia as the way in which they would do religious instruction and have school prayer all the way down to the 1960s when the Supreme Court moved on school prayer. So for over a century and a half after the passage of Jefferson's statute, Virginians debated church-state issues in legislative petitions and newspapers, in church meetings, in court cases, in assembly sessions, and in 4 constitutional conventions called to rewrite the state constitution. Establishing Religious Freedom traces that history. It explores how and why the revolutionary generation of Virginians rejected the British model of an established church in favor of Jefferson's statute. How they and later generations then proceeded to use and abuse that law. Their evolving understandings of church-state separation and the ever-shifting cultural contexts that determined these settlements. History is instructive. Consider Virginia's history with Jefferson's statute as a dry run for what has happened in America. Look how Jefferson prized that statute. Those were the 3 things that are written on his tombstone by his instruction. Author of the Declaration of Independence, American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom. It says nothing about being President of the United States. That was a headache. So consider Virginia's history a kind of dry run for what has happened in America since the Supreme Court nationalized the First Amendment in the 1940s. And as the last session of the court demonstrated once again, good old Hobby Lobby, the struggle to find a balance between the competing claims of church and state is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. Jefferson was right. He knew it would be one hell of a fight. Thank you.
And at this point, we do have plenty of time for questions and for a question and answer segment. So if anybody wants to start off the conversation for tonight.
Or maybe you'd like to get go back and help yourself with some more wine or
as well. Father Buckley, that's right.
Stuff back there if anybody. Yes, Amy.
I can get us started. So thank you so much. It's so fascinating. So just as a little aside, Elizabeth and I couldn't help but be struck by how similar the debates about education, despite these divergent histories of religious freedom, the history of what was happening in Europe in the 1860s and 70s, it's so similar. I mean, it's all the same. So it's like, you can have an established church, but you still get to the same question of prayer and the idea that exactly in Britain, the debate over public education, which was the Forster Education Act of 1870, which is exactly the same, which was that we can't, in order to get everybody to agree that we should have public education, you're going to have to get all the religion out of it. And then nobody liked that. So then everybody said, well, what religion could we all agree with? And so it ends up, well, we can have some, we have a little, can we have a little God, a little, like, what little amount of Christianity can we all agree to? And it's still very strange, that Church of England schools are state schools still in England, which seems very weird. But one of the things that really struck me in hearing you presented this time was the extent to which the Enlightenment legacy of Jefferson, right? I mean, his really hardcore Enlightenment deist approach to things came into serious battle with evangelical Protestantism, and that so much of your story is about the battle between and I think in saying this Virginia was a dry run for the United States, right? Like that's always struck me about U.S. history, that we have these Enlightenment deist founding fathers who set up a system that then evangelical Protestantism has a really hard time with. And I wondered if you could just...
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the most intriguing things about this, if you look at that statute for religious freedom, if you look at the original, and then you look at the one the legislature passed, they're different. The legislature took out the more rationalistic passages of Jefferson, because the legislature was basically religious in its orientation. It was churchy, and they didn't like any restriction on themselves. So they wanted the freedom to be able to say that they were doing the right thing, and that nobody could challenge them. That's another side of this whole story, is the way in which the laity controlled everything. The laity controlled the church, from the colonial period on. They fought getting a bishop. They didn't want a bishop. They didn't want any power that in any way interrupted their total control over things. And it wasn't because they were deistic or even that rationalistic compared to Jefferson. So it's fascinating. All these different forces, pulls and stuff that we're used to today in our society. Okay. Please.
I always wonder, picking up on what was just said, that even today I fear that a lot of elected officials make statements or cast votes maybe not out of conviction, but out of a fear of not being reelected.
What was your first clue?
Well, they're afraid of someone on the right.
Sure.
But going back to Jefferson's time, is that did some of these legislators you allude to perhaps say this out of fear that their constituents wouldn't return them to the legislature if they sounded too Jeffersonian deistic?
And the voting was always done viva voce then. So that everybody, you always knew who you were casting your ballot for and who cast their ballot for you. It wasn't a secret ballot in the early years.
But I mean, did you unearth some evidence to indicate that these men were voting their conscience or voting their political expedient life?
I think they voted what they wanted. They voted the things that were in their interest.
Not their conviction.
Well, maybe it was their conviction that their interest was
that their interests were their conviction.
Yeah. But it is fascinating because they didn't agree about all this. Okay?
What did they think about Jefferson's idea of nature's God?
They didn't talk about that at all that I can find. As I find deism has a very sad record in Virginia. And I think Mr. Jefferson was pretty discreet too in what he said in public. And he went to church. He was a card-carrying Episcopalian, or dues-paying Episcopalian.
But you don't link that to the stuff that they took out.
Oh, I think they took out things that were more rationalistic. You can go to it's all been documented what they took out. And Madison says afterwards, he said, well, they passed the bill somewhat marred. But they passed the bill. Please, Elizabeth?
So can I go back to the Mormons at the beginning?
Sure.
At the beginning, because what I think is interesting, and you didn't talk much about this here, but it's always a story that strikes me as very interesting because, of course, that's a decision that draws on Jefferson's notion of fairly rigid and absolute religious freedom and separation of church and state, and is used to justify a decision that places a church under the law of the land, right? So that abolishes and prohibits polygamy as a practice within the Mormon church. And what I think is interesting, and I'm wondering if you can maybe comment on this, is the way in which how do I want to put this? understandings, how people talk about religious freedom, how people have used religious freedom, have really changed in the very recent past to be used in such a way as to almost liberate completely religious communities from the law of the land. And I'm thinking here, I mean, you mentioned Hobby Lobby, right? But the exemptions now from the law. So instead of Jefferson's notion of religious freedom being used as a means to place the church under the law, right, and the religious community under the law, now that sort of notion of religious freedom is being used to say, hey, we don't have to obey any of your laws, right? They don't apply to me because I'm doing this out of conviction, right, that this is an act of conscience. And so that seems to me a very interesting development. And I'd be interested in hearing
Well,
you
I think you're
speak
right.
about that.
It's very, and why is it determined this way? It's determined this way because of the people, the way they vote. The way they vote. And if their persuasion is one way, that's going to pass. If they got 5 votes on the Supreme Court.
Right,
See,
which
I
is
really,
not elected, right?
Elizabeth, I think, I mean, my own personal opinion is I think they made a huge mistake when they nationalized the First Amendment. I think they should have left the states alone. I think they should have left the states alone. But that history of the power grab by the Supreme Court is fascinating. As they went through the Bill of Rights and they nationalized piece by piece.
And some of that, of course, is kind of has to happen after the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
So the switch in talking about a nationalization and a national
Well,
approach to
but that takes
slavery
place in the
triggers.
20s. That takes place in the 20s and 30s,
Yeah.
into the 40s.
And much more recently with the Second Amendment, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
the D.C. decision.
But you wonder about all that. And where is the wisdom here? How pluralistic do we want our society to be?
I just
How
want
much-
everybody to think like me. I said I just want everybody to think like me.
No, I mean, can Arkansas be Arkansas? And San Francisco be San Francisco? Do we all have to be alike? I mean, isn't diversity a big value rather than uniformity? That's wandering a bit afar, but I think it's pertinent to the situation we face now. And again, I go back to the law and the culture. This is a fascinating issue. How culture fixes the law. I don't know. What do the lawyers here think? Michael?
Yeah, it's a very basic conflict between do I want to live in a world that is diverse and people have different ideas than I do, or do I want the world to look the way I want it to look? What Catholics were accused of in the early 19th century, wanting to put the Pope in as head of the United States. To some degree, I'd be happy with that, especially with the current Pope. But on the other hand, I don't know that I want the kind of conflict that would result from that. So it's a tough decision for anyone. Do I want the whole world to look like me, that I completely fit in, and everything goes exactly as I want it to be? Or do I want to be in a world in which I'm constantly challenged by other people's ideas, so I'm constantly rethinking my values and who I am?
Please, Jim.
The religious freedom, I think of the initial thing you brought up about polygamy in Utah. And if I get my facts straight, the Supreme Court disallowed the polygamy.
They did. They made a distinction. It was the Reynolds case is fascinating because that's where they drew a distinction between belief and action. You may believe it's okay, but you can't act on it. And we're just controlling the action.
So that,
But what I think is intriguing is, what if that case came up today? Where would the courts go on polygamy now?
And
What do you think?
would it be consistent with what they're doing in terms of health insurance and reproductive rights?
Yes. Yeah. bet you the justices are happy they don't have to deal with polygamy. But could they re-argue that case now? Not from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because that church has given up polygamy. But their splinter groups have not. They're down there busily acting polygamists on the Arizona border. Well, that's a dangerous state.
How about the Muslims in the United States?
Yeah. Well, how about Muslims? How about that? What do you think would happen? Anybody here, any of you lawyers think about that? Steve, do you have any thoughts on this?
Basically, I think the way it ends up working out, it sort of goes back to your point about society and policy is reflected by the current vote, how people vote. And that's going to first be in our elected representatives, and then it's going to ultimately reflect, presumably, in the Supreme Court of Justices. But I think it's going to Mike's comment. I think on any given issue, you can find a person who'll say, I definitely believe that it should be, more religion in society. And then you could, that same person, if presented with a different situation, would say, no, we've got separation of church and state. So I think, society is we're a microcosm. Society just reflects us. And we are complicated people, which makes for a complicated society, which is why the law is ever changing. I think absolutely the Supreme Court could address polygamy now, and I would expect it probably would go differently, because I just think that's where we are as a society right now. But it certainly makes for interesting conversations. It makes the law an ever challenging and fascinating aspect. And being a society, a rule of law means, we've got some definition, we've got some guideposts, but there's a lot of wiggle room in there.
Please.
Well, I was thinking about the issue that you did mention earlier about the founders understanding that somehow virtue and religion were related. And that what happens is that this sort of smushy religious feeling becomes part of American culture. This idea that we're sort of religious, but because of church and state, we can't really say that it's a religion. And so that the problems end up being trying to define where you can draw the line if you still think that there's some way in which the state has an obligation to help produce moral citizens. And that's where it seems to me it really begins to get very tied in on itself. The notion that there's sort of this non-sectarian or quote-unquote Judeo-Christian ethic, or Judeo-Christian culture. I mean, as a Jew, Judeo-Christian is nonsense. So the needs for sort of a unity of feeling and a way of letting people bring their religion into their politics without bringing their church into the state is, I think, where it gets really complicated.
Yeah. Sure.
I think of it in terms of how law reflecting some kind of social consensus. And you have a never-ending discussion about whether government ought to be trying to forge that consensus independently of what's springing up from popular sentiment, or the other way around. You certainly see that these days with respect to right-to-life issues, and some states drawing much more prescriptive regulatory regimes than others around.
Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, you had
But just on that topic of virtue in the 18th century, I think of them more drawing on the ancient Roman Republic than maybe on Christian ideals for their concept of the virtuous citizen.
Yes, that's right.
It's not really a Christian.
I mean, when you go back to the founding era, the ideas of Greece and Rome and the Republic and all that stuff, it all plays. And then religion takes over in the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, let me ask one more. Jefferson's in France in the 1780s.
Mm-hmm.
He comes back. The extremist revolutionaries do all kinds of things to the Catholic Church in France. Did Jefferson ever comment on that? Did that inform his subsequent thinking? Or?
Yeah, but what's fun about Jefferson is that he thought they got their just desserts.
Right.
There were two ministers. Gouverneur Morris preceded Jefferson as minister to France. No, he followed Jefferson as minister of France. And Gouverneur Morris was aghast at what was going on in France during the bloodbaths and so forth. And Jefferson is over there on the other side of the Atlantic, tucked away in Monticello, saying, "Oh, hit him again, harder." Jefferson saying they're getting their just desserts. But Gouverneur Morris thought they were just it was just dreadful. So you have two Americans who take very different positions on what is going on in France.
So when the French government did that enlarge Jefferson's views on church and state? Did it inform them, or not? We don't have any record on that.
I don't think he talked about it in terms of church and state. He just remember he said, every 20 years you should, isn't that right, Tony? Every 20 years you should have a revolution. The tree of liberty needs to be watered by the blood of patriots. Something like that. Did you get that at West Point? You push that. The tree of liberty.
We didn't push revolution.
You didn't, not at West Point. You really didn't push that. Maybe not. Well, thank you all very much.